Ah, so I continue to be dismayed over my own uh, lack of ability to make progress in terms of churning out at least useful or serviceable content on these, matters, because they are uh, centered around a very sort of toxic, confused, ideological, semantic game almost. So there's this horrible sense in which moral language has been appropriated and it's sort of been infused with an ideological worldview, which essentially renders these labels that used to be important moral, um, so it's sort of it has stolen the thunder of another age, of another epoch, of another um, vision, which is now sort of pretty much missing from the public square, and it has no defenders, and it has no one to sort of cut through the yeah. So I I want to clear up something that I said in my last recording, which I made subsequent recordings which I did not upload, which sort of elaborated enough of this topic that sort of ameliorated um, when I sort of misspoke. Well, in some technical sense, I didn't misspeak because I was talking about a sort of historical. Um, I was labeling movements according to their kind of historical significance, when it could easily be interpreted that I was talking about their sort of these labels have potentially a sort of a nebulous, they're a wide umbrella in which they contain some things that I even agree with. So if just to name exactly the topic that I'm trying to get into, is I was making the historical point, and I did actually misspeak, and I've landed on the booby one of the booby traps of the poisonous sort of ideological stuff, because they are the ones that conflate these concepts. They are the ones that basically say feminism is about equality, and that so specifically where I made an error was when I spoke about the gay rights movement, when I should have more correctly said the gay pride tactic, which was sort of which was a that is the toxic element in. I mean, I'm for gay rights. I think that they're important, but the activism for gay rights that was sort of in what I would call the sort of the feminist ideological camp, which falls under the banner gay pride. Gay pride is a wrong is problematic at its core. I mean, it is a fascistic vehicle which has since I mean I would even argue that it was used by feminism as a sort of as a Trojan horse, because somebody else had to sort of validate the tactic first, and so that they could sort of sympathetically piggyback on the kind of on the social currency that then it really gains because it's been used by more than one faction. It's sort of, and that really opens the door to what I would call a kind of a proto-fascist structural interpretation of reality, in which there is no more interpersonal accountability and responsibility. So people aren't individuals; they're just each belonging to their identity faction, and they must represent that identity in their interactions, and they must provide the right sympathy and take on the right amount of guilt and shame that their identity sort of represents in that drama in which the identities themselves hold all moral consideration and the individual has lost all dignity. Um, I've thought of another way in which this can be thought of more simply. Is we see that what has corrupted in our moral discourse is when equality changed from being a principle into an adjective. So, so now people will even utter things like treating people with equality. This is a meaningless statement. It only makes sense in terms of theories of structural oppression, and where everyone is sort of imprinted by their identity and must represent the guilt and the shame, or the claim that they have against the system, and that everyone must sort of be mediated by that sort of by that sort of tokenism, and so, I mean, it's obvious that, for example, the notion gay pride is fundamentally problematic, because it's sort of it is already sort of marred in this warlike revenge, in which, I mean, on some technical sense, it's a strange paradox, because, if gay pride is okay, then either the claim is that straight pride has overreached, and straight pride is in principle okay, and these prides are both okay, but it would be better if they had an equal standing within the society. And so the idea is either that straight pride exists and has either wronged gay pride, or straight pride is in principle wrong, and all pride of your sexual identity is in principle wrong, but gay pride is needed to sort of bring an equilibrium and a balance to the identities. Or somehow everyone must have a separate and equal pride, and which is the most crazy sort of idea in the world, because either people are going to be separate and hypothetically equal, or they're not going to be separate, and in which case, where would you see the equality? Where would this equality show up in terms of some kind of statistical outcome that you're going to measure everything and tally it all up, and then everyone will be apportioned power and prestige and status according to their identity faction, to make sure that everyone has an equal proportional piece of the pie. I mean, it's insane. I mean, if you are going to mediate your life from your identity, I mean, you might as well not be alive. You just, all you have is this collective experience, this collective soul that you're a part of. I mean, it's incredibly fascistic and dehumanizing. The individual is left with nothing. So I understand that I've flown through that perhaps a bit quickly, but just to go back to the point, equality is a principle. It's not an adjective. And so you don't treat people with equality, you treat people as individuals, and this is the importance of non-racialism and non-sexism. It is a slightly weird word, because it's easier to say non-racialism than it is to say non-sexism, or should it be non-sexualism? It doesn't it doesn't roll off the tongue quite nicely, but that concept should have been what even feminism was called, if it was, I would say, if it was morally centered or something like that. But from the start, feminism has had this tension within it, in terms of, well, should we call ourselves feminism? Should we call it equalism? Should we have men in our movement being advocates or leaders? It's sort of right from the start, it has to sort of worry about the tokenism, and so, I mean, and even in second wave feminism, that's pretty much when the structural stuff was invented, and when it effectively was a photocopy of Mein Kampf at that point. And that was what probably infused the invention of gay pride, which then sort of justified its general use. And now we basically have Black Lives Matter sort of stuff, which is exactly the same moral formulation. And so, I mean, the reason why we have a problem with black fascism in South Africa, effectively, historically, you could tie that to gay pride, to the notion of gay pride, the conceptual structure. But I mean, this has got nothing to do with gay people. I mean, if anything, this is much more to do with feminism. This is who cooked this up. And I mean, so just to elaborate on my idea of feminism, just to sort of cut through the weird sort of conflation that feminism means equality. I mean, I see classical feminism has finished its work in the West. Classical feminism, I would consider myself a classical feminist, to sort of invent a term to make sense of it. Classical feminism is equality before the law. We have equality before the law. It's over. Now you have a cultural, if you want to complain about biases and structural oppression or whatever it may be, that is to be negotiated on a cultural level. And in as much as it's being advanced through some kind of groupthink, I mean, it's completely reactionary. It's completely retrograde. It's ironic because they are literally going to create the opposite effect, and they could say, well, we obviously need it because the outcomes aren't lining up. Well, perhaps that's because individuals make different decisions. That's because people have different, a different spectra of talents. Maybe some women are the same interested in the same subject as some men, but it's not going to line up statistically. So what are you going to do? Whine about structural oppression. I mean, it's this. It is this huge presumption that every statistical anomaly or sort of discrepancy is correlated with a cause which has a moral charge attached to it. I mean, it's just, yes, there might be some moral things there, but I mean, how are you going to clean that up through a kind of activism? I mean, it's absolutely insane. If anything, you're only going to change people's minds, in terms of the nitty gritty on the ground sorts of people actually having a way of comporting themselves that breaks stereotypes or something like that. But the idea that you're going to sort of tell people to dissolve their stereotypes in their head, I mean, maybe some of those stereotypes are, stereotypes are almost by definition generalizations. There is this general concept of a kind of there is some philosophy that perhaps needs to be explored in terms of clearing up the legitimate use of, and when I say legitimate in this context, I don't mean like, oh, because I'm allowing you to use a generalization in this case or that case, but I mean in terms of having a moral, a morally consistent use of in terms of non-racialism and non-sexism, how generalizations come to be part of your sort of thinking. I don't want to sort of rehash that whole argument, but Coleman Hughes, in his let me think of the name of his lecture. I think that he made a lecture called it has anti-racism in the title. I can't remember if it was anti-racism and non-racialism, two competing worldviews. It named something like that. Or maybe it was anti-racism and equality, two competing worldviews. And so, so I mean, just as much as equality is not an adjective, you're not going to be able to sort of say, you're not going to be able to test if people are sufficiently anti-racist or, the question is, are they non-racialist? That, and so, are they treating people as individuals, or they're sort of I'm slightly giving an overview, and I'm sort of skipping over some delicate, nuanced points that which make important distinctions that mean that you can still act intelligently according to pieces of information, but your readiness to restructure those impressions that you have, which are general impressions, and your labeling of those impressions as generalizations, and then your willingness to concede them, that is really the test of negotiating within a society as an individual, having interpersonal experiences and communication with other people. But merely treating people as tokens of their identity, I mean, is intrinsically problematic. And having a politics that that is trying to resolve the moral problem from that top-down approach, I mean, is hideous. It's disgusting. I mean, it's going to dismantle the functioning of a liberal society completely. I mean, it's just, it's going to self-destruct every sort of value, because it eventually, it's such a simplistic worldview that requires so much distortion just to keep the narrative straight, just to keep it believable. You have to create so much propaganda, so much hate, so much, sort of this idea of this collective weakness, so that you could be owed some collective sympathy that you can extract from people of the right identity, that then you can scapegoat and such. It's just, it's so toxic. It also, the proponents of this sort of ideology, they are themselves usually confused, because they are using labels which they believe carry a kind of moral currency, but they're not rooted in any of the thinking in some sense. They're just sort of riding the tide. They're riding the wave of this sort of groupthink. And they're quite and they're willing to play sort of any sophistry, any sort of label juggling, and so it's weird, because they will kind of be on both sides of the argument, where they will suddenly they'll wear the hat of this sort of where they think they're sort of representing almost the traditional value of the non-racialist worldview, because that's where they want to be at the end of the day, after they've achieved it through these draconian outcome measuring adjective of equality that they've infused within the system, that they've sort of empowered their administrators to advance, while crushing individuals essentially for the collective aesthetic of living in a somewhat a separate but equal, where the identities are separate but where they have an equal dignity, that the identities themselves get all the value, and the individual is left essentially having to conform, having to be promoted through that very common denominator vehicle of identity. And so it is and that is where the sort of the identity slavery sort of comes in. So it's like you can see this, for example, in the rhetoric of Julius Malema, where he says, "Oh, the president gets away with this rhetoric because he's treating us like stupid blacks." That's effectively his sort of thing, is because blacks are stupid, so he can actually bully the identity into believing that he must be right, or that if you don't think exactly like Julius Malema, then you are a stupid black. So it's like you're failing your identity. So it's like you've got two moral standards to live up to. You've got your identity to live up to, that you have to sort of collectively promote as a collective project of a collective salvation, and that must be facilitated effectively by being in league with its representative, with its voice, with its Führer, with its savior. So it is a very it's interesting how it sort of conflates moral standards with a kind of a moral code that gets baked into a power game, and a sort of measuring this power game, which is again, I mean, it's really sad, because as soon as you implement its solutions, it creates more of the problem. It literally doesn't actually fix the pride, because it extracts the pride by the denigration, by the comparative denigration of the scapegoat. So essentially, they vindicate their self-righteousness from revenge. And so it is the revenge essentially that they are left with. It's not with the lifting of standards. It's with the equalizing of standards, which is essentially achieved by destruction of the comparative identity, with the evil identity, with the identity that has the guilt and the shame attached to it. And so the ideology is geared towards bringing about equality between the identities, but it really does sort of it finds that equality essentially not by improving life on the ground, but by bringing everyone down towards some sort of lowest common denominator while feeling self-righteous about itself. It's in some metaphysical sense, because of the things that are being overlooked, and because of the resentments and the sort of the strange non-thinking that is occurring there. It's sort of I think this is also why the Nazi society effectively self-destructed, is because I've described this before, but basically when you are, everything rests on the shoulder of the savior, on the leader, and therefore the leader has to believe that he is on the side of God. So he has to start taking risks just to sort of prove it to himself. He has to sort of go to war with Russia in the winter, because otherwise how can he know that destiny is really belongs to him, and that God is on his side in some sense? So to prove that the whole project is correct, it essentially has to go to war with the world. And unless it's in a constant aggravated state of tension, it has no room for itself to imagine its kind of its correctness. It only knows itself while it is engaged in some kind of attrition in some sense. And so and this is also when it comes when the Nazi thinkers are considering that we actually need to keep the Jews around, because if we don't have a scapegoat, we're not going to be able to culturally perpetuate the system. I mean, it's crazy, but even when they were winning the war, they had to sort of create these book burnings and these rallies and almost like pep rallies, just to keep the sort of the sense of because they don't have a positive idea of value. They only have a negative idea of value, which is destroying oppression, destroying infiltration. That they have to be in this constant civil war of opposing the colonization of their mind. It becomes a metaphysical, spiritual defect that essentially grounds the rightness of the entire culture. It's very unstable. This mentality will not last 30 years. I mean, the human being that comes out of this culture 30 years later is going to be it's going to be horrendous. I mean, the Germans are still culturally affected by it. There's still the residue of this sort of pollution of the soul. It's it really is rife to sort of develop crazy, sorts of the narcissistic autism that is used to insulate the ideological machinery. I mean, and you can see this very much when you're dealing with these so-called progressives and these so-called identity politics proponents. The kind of the filtering that they have to do into buying the generalized narrative that we just have to bite our tongue because that identity needs to be taken down a peg so that the other identity can sort of rectify itself and reestablish its pride. It's that kind of horse trading, that kind of when you are dealing in that kind of social currency. I mean, you don't have a liberal society anymore. You effectively already have had your public discourse taken over by a totalitarian sentiment. Already there is no. Effectively the sort of the value system of non-racialism. It has no advocacy. it is in the process of being rooted out of the legal system. That is what the land expropriation without compensation is essentially there to do, is to create the political token, the political lever, essentially to eject non-racialism from the country, and also to facilitate essentially endless corruption. That will just be automatically concealed under the veil of the sort of the identity justice and justice for, because you see, when you're acting on behalf of the identity, it doesn't make a difference in some sense who is getting the benefit, as long as the right person is getting taken down a peg. So they don't have to be very efficient at redistributing the plunder, and in fact the ideology, it doesn't really make too much of a difference where the plunder goes, because it's done in the name of the identity. I did also, in one of the addendums that I never uploaded, go into the Lord of the Rings sort of analogy, and the Lord of the Rings really is a bit of a metaphor of identity politics, that the rings were given to the different races, and many certain different rings, to sort of segment, and so each ring, but the ring really symbolizes the authority to rule and power. And the thing about the ring is that the one ring, which is the true ring, which actually secretly rules them all, is that it's interesting because what this ring actually does is, when you wear it, is it gives you invisibility. It makes you invisible. And that's exactly the flaw in the ideology of identity politics, is that the leadership eventually becomes an invisible moral force that is just sort of the representative of the entire system, of the entire sort of magisteria of broken down issues, and so it sort of has this invisible hand that it's meant to sort of be facilitating and mediating between, and it moves unseen. This analogy doesn't really. I'm just trying to think. But so I mean that is the invisible corruption within the politics of identity politics. That is the sort of the biggest crime. Is that it will inevitably be a never-ending engine of facilitating plunder and mismanagement and ineffective things, because you cannot speak against these things forthrightly, because then you're stepping on the toes of identity politics. You're stepping on the structure and the schema of how identity politics is meant to be promulgated, and how identity politics sees itself as sort of managing its affairs. And those affairs are not different. Those affairs are quite different from intelligent management and intelligent government. It's just a completely different value. Sort of lost my thread slightly, but that there is probably more that could be gone into on those sorts of things. About the invisibility, I've made a list of some rhetoric. Let me see. Let me see if any of this is worth reading out. That some of this stuff is not really sort of actionable rhetoric, but it is perhaps it's an illustration of something, or Yeah, so I was just going to say as well, as a general point, that I think that what is sometimes overlooked in combating proponents of identity politics is simplistic questions aren't asked and simplistic complaints aren't made. Because the identity politics is so vile and toxic within its own convoluted conflation and use of moral labels and things like that. You just think, well, that's such a bad faith position. That's such an egregious racist point of view using that language, and repurposing that language and sort of redrawing the lines in such a radical way that you think, okay, well, they've just decided to be that toxic. But I think it is really worth unveiling that, or at least unmasking it to some extent, or at least making it patent, making it express itself by just asking simple questions. Don't try to ask leading questions. Try to ask basic, simple questions to almost bring home a basic complaint and to show a lagging issue that it is just simply incapable of addressing. And you know, don't you don't have to show them up immediately that their answer to your simple question was weird. I mean, maybe they'll even sort of not take the bait. Maybe they'll ignore the question. Maybe they'll say, we don't have time to answer some, baby questions. We're here trying to do these sophisticated things. But then, even then, you could get an answer like that. You could turn it on its head and say, well, that your plans aren't practical at all. Then you could make, so whatever deflection they have or answer they have, it could be part of a sort of a rhetorical exchange that it itself would show the depth and the depravity that is sort of being perpetrated. And so what I mean by simple questions would be, well, what about the white people that actually believed in the New South Africa and that actually pay their taxes? You sort of create an anecdote, a contemplative anecdote, and then they'll say, well, those people are outnumbered by the white monopoly capitalists. And it's like, well, maybe if we empowered small and medium businesses, we would actually have more of a counterexample. But because, the economy has essentially been sabotaged, well, anyway, so... So I just say, complain about the obvious oversight of Julius Malema's rhetoric. If you don't express complaints because they are just so obvious, state the obvious. Draw out the obvious incoherence and oversights, not defensively, with the correct amount of simple focus on dismantling the dishonest flow of Julius's rhetoric. And so you can almost take the emotional impetus in the rhetoric, or the logical claim in the rhetoric, and you just ask a simple question about it. You almost like a rhetorical question. It doesn't have to be a direct question. You can have it as an open, that it could be open as you make the rhetorical question as an open, they could, as in you're not trying to defend it. They can answer it if they want to, but it's used as a kind of rhetorical question as a shield. And then at least you can start to mount the case that they are being radically aggressive in a way in which you can actually count you can start to see the bodies of their hypothetical victims in what is otherwise their bombastic rhetoric, which goes without a sort of an accounting attached to it. It goes without, what would that actually end up costing the country? What would that actually end up undermining and sort of disrupting and dismantling? And a lot of that dismantling and hopelessness is because we generally have bad conditions which have been essentially perpetuated by a state that is happy to essentially use business as the whipping boy. That, oh, well, business just isn't doing well enough, when they've never essentially done anything other than sort of disrupt small and medium business, with sort of racialist red tape and such. Because I guess, and you could also, I would simplify that claim that, obviously government doesn't care about small and medium businesses because there's nothing to be corrupt about in small and medium businesses. You don't extract large amounts of money from small and medium businesses. They don't offer, sort of deep pockets to get into political corruption with. You don't. Why act on their behalf when there's no political incentive, essentially, other than the general upliftment of the country? But I mean, obviously, when you've got a government that won't even deliver textbooks to schools because they essentially don't want people to urbanize and to develop so that they can't be sold more endless liberation, like why? How can you sell a country liberation if you have already economically liberated them? How can you facilitate um, you know, stealing from SEOs, and then when that runs dry, taking from the right identity according to the politics directly because you've run out of government resources to plunder. If you don't have so I mean, like, we are basically suffering from a political corrupt class, a political elite that is displacing a private elite that would have the ability to actually transform the economy of the country. But because, there's this lopsided state, essentially, that is trying to influence and control more resources because it can't get over its political plunder, its addiction to political plunder. Okay, again, this is not perhaps such viable rhetoric, but these are some points that maybe I should mention. When merely promoting the right identity, in inverted commas, defines who is doing a good thing, then the followers are being robbed by their leaders, robbed of their autonomy, robbed of their leaders' accountability for intelligent and real leadership, because hate and revenge becomes the only marks of good policy that will be used to conceal corruption and irresponsible use of power. The idea that to have a strong identity which can live out your life for you and make any difficulty more easy is a mythology. Using identity like this is a con job, and no life can be operated that way without narcissistic rage and an autistic self-referential denial and thought controls. Julius Malema lives in a cartoon. The more miserable you get these sorts of these caricatures that, as if business owners are more rich the more miserable that their workers are. This is the kind of obvious point that I would make. So, like, are you, the general attitude and suggestion of a lot of this radical thinking is built in these sorts of strange cartoons that the more exploited the workers, the richer the white monopoly capital, or something like that. That the reason why people's lives are bad is because capitalists are exploiting them and stuff like that. But I would point out the logic. That okay, so if your logic is the more miserable the workers, the richer the business owners, and just point out that this is not how small and medium businesses operate. And perhaps that would be more common knowledge if we didn't live in a sabotaged economy by toxic racialist identity consciousness. So it's like, just to sort of give a motif of a countervailing, counteracting ideological position. This is not such a well phrased out thing, but Julius Malema calls a stupid black anyone who doesn't think just like him. He is not prepared to call people stupid just because they don't think just like him, but through the power of identity politics, he gets this power as he takes it upon himself to promote blackness and get rewarded with special demigod pretensions and powers. So that's another sort of just a summary motif of what how this stuff, sort of operates rhetorically. I've got a whole lot of writing here that gets into the technical things of sort of generally how the politics of feminism and the general sentiments of feminism sort of manifested into this proto-fascism. But not that's be and so it's interesting because the cannibalism that exists within identity politics is essentially because it will never be stable until it settles on one identity. This is why identity politics, this is why Hitler called them useful idiots, because they spread fascistic values, but they have a wider conception of justice in that they actually believe that there is a solution in which every identity can end up equal. This is so. Basically, the mark of a proto-fascist is they actually believe in the separate but equal mantra. They actually believe that it's possible to have one society that is delivering that equal justice, even though it's obviously impossible. Whereas the fascists will still use that as part of their almost philosophical premise, but they are using it in bad faith because they know that it's not going to be equality at the end of the day. They know that essentially they're going to use the other identity as their as a ploy, essentially, as a way to coalesce and generate a kind of a societal consensus. And so in some sense this doesn't work either. This what I'm about to say doesn't work as rhetoric, but it's just a technical point, but not really useful in any sense. But so this is something what I would call a rhetorical gambit, but which just only makes sense conceptually. Tell Julius to stay in his own lane. Some people are trying to speak on behalf of all South Africans, while others are pretending to try to speak for those that give them the power to conceal their corruptions and scapegoat the political failures of identity salvation. So that's just a sort of a meta point. So in some sense, how they tell themselves to stay in their own lane so that they don't conflict with each other, because they all want to extract justice from the system for the different forms of structural oppression that are suffered differently. But obviously, if they each take their pound of flesh, there is not enough meat left to redistribute, right? Because the identity politics doesn't work. And so they've got an oversubscription of justice to what the system is capable of essentially facilitating by its decomposition, and so they each want to, like you can't have a zombie and a wolf and a jackal sharing the same dead corpse. It doesn't work. And so if they want to, they can't share a meal. It has to be one identity, only one is going to take hold. Only one can actually take power. And so this is why the identity politics eventually whittles down into a single identity. It has to be one catch-all, and then they might have this general illusion that they're going to be able to bring justice to every identity, and that identities will be allowed to be complex and deep, and you'll have a multifaceted identity. That is the kind of the vision of an expanded liberty within their system. But the truth is that you actually end up having less identity at the end of it. You end up having one, like the one ring to rule them all. That's what it boils down to. So, you're told at the beginning that you have 7 rings for the elves and 9 rings for the humans or whatever, but it ends up being one. And it also, as I said, if you're not connected to the actual leadership at the top, you're not empowered. It doesn't actually, hypothetically your identity gets empowered, but that has nothing to do with people on the ground. It's just the sort of the ideological it's just the propaganda of the system, of the new system. But this is what fascism has always done. It's always pretended to be progressive while being the most reactionary force there is. I mean, a good example of this is imagine, the kind of state control that Julius Malema talks about. I mean, do you really think that if he got in power, there would still be unions? Do you think that there would be any kind of workers, decentralized workers, organization. No, it would all be taken over by the state instantly. I mean, he would, he would dismantle them instantly, and if they didn't want to dismantle, then who knows what would happen. But I mean, it's also it's not just Julius Malema. If anything, you have to understand that this is coming from the Zuma faction within the ANC and Julius Malema on the outside, and between the kind of the hidden hand and the sort of and the person who's pushing this ground on the outside. I mean, they're both going towards the same place. They're both going towards state control, and unaccountable power, essentially. Which, I mean, in some sense, they already have, because if anything, the more that they fail, the more the fascist politicians get rewarded at the polls. It seems. The more the ideology fails, the more power they need. This is the kind of negative feedback loop that Hitler was able to generate through the waves of the control of the narrative. And and it's just like Weimar Germany, when they had people forget that the area, that racist studies that they had in the classroom in high school and university, it's the same way that they're teaching identity politics in schools. In the New South Africa, it's absolutely, these people should be in jail. I mean, they are undermining the Constitution. They are directly damaging the Constitution. They are acting unconstitutionally. They should, this is hate speech. The doctrine of structural racism is antithetical to non-racialism and non-sexism. I mean, it is hideous. Anyway, okay, I've probably said enough. Let me just see if there's anything here. I don't know if I should read that out, but how challenges are faced or dealt with determines the character of a people and a nation. Character is destiny, and revenge will only promote the anger, which will only grow as the political radicals continue to push their excuse to plunder under the cover of justice to the identity, in brackets, and not the people, whose justice will be stolen by racialist generalization. By racist generalization. And conforming to whatever narrative is said about the identity. The problem is this is a bit of a semantic point, but this is something that I can add, is that in some sense there are two forms of identity. There's an identity that is somewhat innocuous, because it's just a label. You're using it as a way to describe your values. So if you say, I identify as this, you're telling basically someone what you value. You're describing your values to them. And then there's another kind of identity in which the identity is the valuable prize, is the actual nexus of moral consideration. So the one is just a way of a shorthand of saying, I believe in these things. And the other one is, no, I actually believe in my identity. My identity is my idol. It is it is what I sacrifice to. It is what I'm trying to promote. It is the vehicle of my collective destiny in some sense. Now, it's weird because your values can do all of that as well. So it's like, you can sacrifice for your values. You can sacrifice for liberty, for freedom, but when you are sacrificing for your identity, then essentially you're being fundamentally exclusionary, or you're being fundamentally prejudiced, or you're being fundamentally invidious in some sense. The idea that you can be invidious so as to promote a greater equality in terms of some kind of societal world narrative. This is something, okay, and I'm touching on the issue of postmodernism slightly, because postmodernism has this weird paradox of a making, it claims to not have an overarching meta narrative, and in so doing it makes factional lived experience, or I mean, I would say there is a lot of bad faith within the postmodernistic camp, because as soon as you throw away the idea that there's this kind of overarching value system or something like that, or narrative, then why would you suddenly identify with your group? Why does then your group, your historical lineage, or something like that, why is something as arbitrary as that, why does that suddenly just belong to you? I mean, it is this sort of strange fascistic thing that, like your lineage, your cells, your blood cells, or something like that from history, it's there's a lot of strange assumptions built into the practicing of a kind of a postmodern. I mean, you know, it, I mean, there is some philosophical discussion to be had about those issues, but how they've been cashed out is just, I mean, it's not even. I mean, they pride themselves over essentially not being reasonable, but their being pro their own race. You know, it's quite scary how they've been able to fly under the radar, how such a disgusting and vicious worldview has effectively been able to establish itself within the academy and promote its, vile and disgusting doctrines that are patently anti-constitutional, that they undermine our constitutional values with public money. It is probably, uh, and I don't, on some level, I don't even, um, you know, I don't know what argument you could make for these people in terms of academic freedom or something like that. Uh, if some other country wants to let these people exist, then they can exist overseas. But if you're in this country, they should be charged with undermining the constitution. I mean, constitutional damages. These people should be sentenced. Hopefully, I mean, we need at some point we need the articulation of the justice system to stand up for these values. Um, Otherwise, effectively, we never had them. There's no right without a remedy. We have foundational constitutional values, which effectively even Parliament now has, in signing on that committee, Parliament has essentially gone rogue and has already sort of spat in the face of the constitutional democracy. We live in a the constitution is supreme, not Parliament, and Parliament has already basically written up a document that wants to rob non-racialism from the constitution. So, you know, essentially Parliament has done something like acted towards fomenting a civil war, as far as I can see, or it has acted in a despicable way against the Constitution. So we live in a very sort of strange time. I mean, technically, I think the only way to technically, um, I don't have the wording exactly in my head, but I think the only way to perhaps live up to how that committee was already established is you would have to do something like say you can take government land without compensation. That would probably be the only thing that you would be able to do, is you would be able to expropriate government land without compensation. That might be the only constitutionally viable way of not, of essentially not contravening, or at least not racializing the property clause in the Constitution. But I mean, obviously, this political issue was designed essentially to be the wedge of forcing in the fascist uh, the fascist politics, um, and to sort of be the vanguard for popularizing and to normalizing the fascism. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of things that are normalizing fascism. There's the academy, there are these coordinated journalists that are around near the end of I think near the end of June every year, I think they aim for about August. They try to see if they can have like the beginning of a civil war in August. They always sort of bake up a coordinated synthesis of stories and politics. And every August for like the last 3 years, I mean, we've just been very lucky that we had Obama defuse the situation once, and then we had the what was it called, the International Citizen Concert. Um, without those two things, I mean, I don't even know what might have happened already in this country. But now, I don't know who's coming to the rescue this time. So, unless we actually start developing some ethical backbones, I don't see, unless we're capable of actually defusing this stuff directly and confronting it on some level, or having some kind of alternative vision that at least contrasts. I mean, where if we don't have any black leadership in this country that's going to speak out against racism, I mean, it's over. Um, and obviously, it doesn't help that the words themselves have been woven into a essentially a fascist worldview, that they've been appropriated. Well, even oh, I didn't even mention the stuff about Mandela's daughter, who I mean, she really is as much as a disgrace to her father as Winnie Mandela was. Um, I mean, such a disgusting racist like that, that obviously has no appreciation of non-racialism. She is just, part of. Well, I had, in one of my other recordings, I had a whole treatment of this particular issue and talking about the possible rhetorical opportunity around it and such. But yeah, I mean, this, I would say, is part of this coordinated effort to ferment, a kind of a civil unrest. I mean, what's even more disgusting about, her tweets is the benefit that this offers people like her, because it's the politically connected that really benefit from government intervention in the economy and government control of resources. They're the ones who get the money, essentially. They're the ones who get the big benefits, whereas the common people are the ones that suffer. I mean, like, hasn't the ANC already destroyed our power supply? And now this woman is gleefully, rife to collect her political, sort of however she's connected within the cadre deployment allegiance faction or whatever, with their little cliques and their each their own separate streams of shared plunder. Um, so she stands to gain personally quite a lot, whereas a country has a food supply problem that is going to be undermined by this kind of, and if there is a disruption in the food supply, who gets blamed? Not the government. It's a win-win for them. Even as it's a complete destruction for the people on the ground. And essentially, all they had to do was drum up the hate and the revenge, which, these are the things that these divisive tweets do. So it's so disgusting on so many different levels. I mean, it is. It just shows you the nature of political. The political incentive for unaccountable power and the use of power, under the umbrella of the identity and promoting blackness and the project of the promotion of the black identity. How essentially, you get a never-ending procession of more hopelessness and more, inability to actually have a liberal and open society. You just, you see the challenge of all that in one package. It's almost like a summary of exactly what's wrong with this country. The unaccountable ANC lording over a moral claim that essentially gives them endless an endless capacity to freely indulge and experiment and sabotage an economy, and the sort of the foundational aspects of an economy, which would be something like the rule of law and property rights, and something like non-racialism, because if you don't have non-racialism as some kind of feature in the law, in terms of the rule of law, this is essentially why small and medium businesses are completely sabotaged, is because the red tape and the bureaucracy and the racialized identity politics that is infused in labor relations is just, it's hard enough just to get people with the right skills. Now you have to count people's ethnicities as well, and then you have to do it in the right proportion. And then what happens if someone leaves and you have to get someone new? You have to preserve your numbers somehow. It's just, the head hunting attached to that, the token value of labor that then becomes to supersede the actual value of productivity. It's completely unworkable. Big companies that have generic positions that can just sort of, it doesn't really matter. As long as they have the same degree, they can fulfill the same function. Like big companies can absorb. It's slightly disruptive to them, but in as much as it's disruptive to big companies, they can cope with it. And therefore also they don't have to deal with the competition from small and medium businesses that definitely can't cope with it. And so we don't have a growing economy. We don't have small and medium businesses flourishing because, it's just absolutely insane. And so you've just got some big businesses, which is, I guess, those are the players that government actually really cares about. And, I guess they plundered ESCOM until it had nothing left to be taken from, and now there's nothing left in the state that essentially can't be carried off. And so now they need to go after private land, which is, to go from willing buyer, willing seller to expropriation without compensation. There's a whole spectrum of things that you could do between those two binary choices. It's not like it's a binary choice. You could simply just put more money into the system. You could put more money into buying the property. You could offer more money to incentivize people selling the land. We have apportioned less than 1% of the budget for land reform. And if the money apportioned for land reform was actually used effectively instead of basically being corruptly stolen by politically connected forms of corruption, it's already been proven that the money put into land reform would have effectively already fixed the problem if they had just bought all the land that comes up on the market. If they use the money for land reform to buy farmland that naturally came up onto the market and gave that land to people, you already would have fixed the problem. People would already have land. Obviously there are specific instances where people want specific pieces of land, ancestral land. That is something that, that is a different case. That is a more specialized case, and that is something that does need a special regard to it. But that is not why expropriation without compensation is being pushed, that is obviously being put. I mean, it wouldn't even apply. I mean, the legal measures that would have to come into effect would mean that it could almost never be used. It would not be appropriate to be implemented. Just because you've got something on the books doesn't mean that you can force the courts to actually operate in that way. That's not how the court system works. Our constitution is superior to the two pieces of legislation. And if you want to change the constitution to allow expropriation without compensation, you would have to have a 3/4 majority, because you would have to change the non-racialism in Chapter 1, because that would be the only way to do it. You would have to rob the Constitution of non-racialism. So I mean, this whole issue is a smokescreen, effectively, for the fascists within the ANC, and for Julius Malema as well, for their politics to win out. I mean, it's the whole thing is a anyway, I've repeated myself enough, probably.